Hi, this is the AI Storyteller. I'm Mark. The work we are interpreting in this issue is the autobiographical novel, David Copperfield, by the famous 19th century British writer Charles Dickens. Why did we choose this extremely lengthy piece? I believe there are two reasons. Firstly, in the English-speaking world, Dickens holds an incredibly important position. No critic or scholar can ignore his works, and no English writer dares to claim they haven't been influenced by Dickens. Such a great writer deserves our deep understanding. David Copperfield is an autobiographical novel, and many of the protagonist David's experiences are drawn from Dickens' own life, providing us with an excellent opportunity to learn about Dickens himself. Secondly, Dickens is often called the Great Londoner, and in this book, you can not only see the bustling streets of Victorian-era London with its diverse inhabitants, and hear the cries of various street vendors and the sounds of carriages passing by, but also smell the stench from the sewers and the aroma of freshly baked bread from the bakeries. More importantly, through Dickens' novel, you can gain insight into the lifestyle, social customs, and moral values of the people of that time. So let's delve directly into the novel, simultaneously narrating the life story of the protagonist, David, and the life story of the author, Dickens. It's worth noting that there are a plethora of characters in this book, requiring a high level of attention, so I hope you will listen attentively. David's parents were a typical older husband and younger wife couple. They owned a house near London and had some other assets, belonging to the English gentry and forming an important part of the British middle class. Unfortunately, David's father passed away before David was born. When his father's aunt came to visit, she was eagerly anticipating the birth of an heir, hoping for a girl. However, when she discovered that a boy, David, was born instead, this eccentric aunt immediately left without looking back. Fortunately, a kind and loyal fat housekeeper named Peggotty took meticulous care of the orphaned mother and child, bringing some stability to their lives. The harmonious life of the three primary household members lasted only a few years. After David's mother remarried, their peaceful life was disrupted. David's stepfather was originally their neighbor, with a strict and domineering personality, and an overwhelming desire for control. After their marriage, he brought his own sister into the household under the guise of helping with housework, effectively taking control of the family's finances from David's mother. David's mother, lacking life experience and with a weak will, along with her financial authority being stripped away, was essentially completely controlled by the stepfather and his sister. So, even though she felt pity for her son, she had no choice but to let the siblings handle David as they pleased. Consequently, David was frequently subjected to abuse at home. On one occasion, when David couldn't recite a lesson, he bit his stepfather in desperation. His stepfather was furious, first whipping David, then confining him, and finally deciding to send him to a boarding school. Dickens' childhood was not quite as dramatic. On February 7, 1812, Dickens was born in the port city of Portsmouth in the southeast of England. Since the Victorian era, this place had been an important naval base for the British Navy. Dickens' father was an official in the Navy's Commissariat Department, and in terms of both income and social status, the Dickens family could be considered a typical middle-class family. The reason for highlighting his family background is that class was an absolute paramount concern in British social life. It not only signified differences in social status but also influenced the way British people thought and their moral values. Even in today's Britain, people remain highly sensitive to class, and in Dickens' time, the divide between different classes was an almost insurmountable chasm. As the story progresses, we will discover that this is not only something Dickens criticizes but also a set of values he seeks to protect. Therefore, we can consider the concept of class as a key to understanding Dickens and using it to unlock his literary world. Returning to the story itself, David is sent to a boarding school in the outskirts of London. As a young child, he embarks on the journey alone on a stagecoach, carrying with him a deep sense of loneliness and fear. Upon arriving at the school, he realizes that it's actually the holiday season, and there are no other students there. This is a punishment inflicted upon him by his stepfather and stepsister, who also demand that he wear a sign around his neck that says, "Beware, he bites." This further damages David's tender psyche. The headmaster of the school is a sadistic figure, and nearly every student experiences his physical punishments. Additionally, bullying among students is commonplace in this harsh environment. Bullying, corporal punishment, and abuse in British boarding schools, along with the pervasive class system and a culture of elitism, are not new to us. In a previous interpretation of Jane Eyre, the protagonist also grew up in such a boarding school. It appears that David's school life will be filled with pain and misfortune as well. Fortunately, David gains the protection of Steerforth, an older student who is highly esteemed among the pupils. In return, David willingly hands over his pocket money to Steerforth and shares various stories from the books he reads with him every day. Here, the author seems to be suggesting that David possesses a natural talent for storytelling from a young age, which sets the stage for his future as a writer. With Steerforth's protection, David's life at the boarding school was relatively calm, and bullying and corporal punishment were not the dominant themes of his school life. There are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, it's related to the author's own experiences. Dickens had fond memories of his own school days. Secondly, compared to his family life, David's school life was relatively easy and enjoyable. Therefore, we find that in Dickens' portrayal, life at the boarding school is much milder and less harsh than in the works of other British authors. At school, David followed Steerforth everywhere, even if it meant going against his own conscience and sense of justice. When Steerforth mocked a teacher of humble origins to the point where the teacher resigned, David didn't agree with this but dared not oppose Steerforth's actions. In fact, their differences on this matter were not only due to their contrasting personalities but also reflected their vastly different class perspectives, foreshadowing their drastically different destinies. As Christmas approached, when David returned home for the holiday, he discovered that his mother had given birth to another baby boy. In the eyes of his stepfather and stepsister, David became even more of a burden, and it was only the maid who continued to treat him kindly. In March of the following year, on David's birthday, he received a letter from home. Expecting it to be a birthday greeting from his mother, he was devastated to learn that his mother had passed away. While his mother was alive, his stepfather and stepsister already considered David a burden, and after his mother's death, they could no longer tolerate his presence. His stepfather claimed that the family was under great financial strain and couldn't afford to send David back to school. He hypocritically told David that even though he couldn't continue his education, he could still gain experience in other ways, such as working as a laborer at a warehouse where he had a stake. In reality, this meant David was to become a cheap child laborer. With no other options, David set out for London on his own and began his life as a laborer. The work was long, the pay was meager, and going hungry was a common occurrence. David had to carefully budget every penny to ensure he could exchange it for food. Interestingly, his meals often included alcoholic beverages, primarily beer, because it provided a sense of fullness. This indicates that during the Victorian era in Britain, minors were allowed to consume alcohol. During this time, David lodged with Mr. Micawber. Mr. Micawber, on the surface, appeared to be a showy and extravagant character, but in reality, he was a kind-hearted person. However, he was profligate and lacked a sense of responsibility, often borrowing money and failing to repay it. Due to these financial troubles, he had been sued and even spent some time in prison. When Dickens created this character, he was undoubtedly thinking of his own father. Charles Dickens Sr., as an official in the Navy's Commissariat Department, earned enough to provide a decent life for his family. However, he was bad at managing finances, extravagant, and had to borrow money frequently. On one occasion, he spent 4 months in debtor's prison because he couldn't repay his debts. It's precisely because of these circumstances that young Dickens embarked on his journey into society at the age of 12, becoming a child laborer in a shoe polish factory. For David in the story, the impact of his job as a warehouse laborer was more on the psychological level. David felt ashamed and hopeless about his descent into this menial role. He believed that a young man as honest, intelligent, and talented as himself shouldn't be experiencing such a fate. In fact, David's feelings mirrored Dickens' own inner thoughts at the time. There is evidence to suggest that this portion of the novel was initially written as part of Dickens' autobiography but was later incorporated into the novel when he decided not to publish his autobiography, possibly due to concerns about his parents' reputation. Why did David feel ashamed? It was simply because he had gone from being a middle-class young gentleman to a lowly child laborer. However, as George Orwell criticized Dickens, if David shouldn't have to endure the fate of becoming a child laborer, what about the other children working alongside him? It seems that Dickens never paid attention to their fates. In fact, this is one of the contentious aspects of Dickens' work. Supporters of Dickens argue that his novels effectively expose the dark side of British society with deep and critical insights. On the other hand, critics argue that Dickens' critique is limited to the moral realm and never addresses the need for structural societal change, so it lacks true critical depth. In reality, Dickens was neither entirely radical nor entirely conservative. His novels contain elements of criticism of the darker aspects of society, praise for noble character, sympathy for the weak, and a perpetuation of class-based ideas, influenced by the norms of his time. These ideas may appear superficial or even incomprehensible to modern readers but were considered conventional truths in his era. The dual pressures of both the spirit and material circumstances eventually led David to make a determined effort to change his situation. It was during this time that he remembered his father's aunt, the eccentric Aunt Betsy Trotwood. With a desperate resolve, David fled from the warehouse, aiming to reach Dover and seek refuge with his aunt. However, before he could even leave London, he was robbed of his belongings and travel funds. With no money for transportation, David had to walk the entire way, a journey that took him a grueling 6 days to traverse the more than 100-kilometer distance between London and Dover. His ability to complete this journey at such a young age speaks to the strength of his willpower. David's aunt, whom he had never met before, indeed had an eccentric personality, and was known for her sharp tongue. However, she was also remarkably warm-hearted and could be considered quite a character. She not only took David in but also fiercely rebuked his stepfather and stepsister when they came looking for him. From this point on, David was officially adopted by his aunt, and a new chapter of his life began. Shortly after settling in Dover, David's aunt arranged for him to attend school in Canterbury. Canterbury, located roughly 30 kilometers from Dover, had been England's religious center since the 16th century, and the famous Canterbury Cathedral stood there. His aunt chose to send David to school in Canterbury for several reasons. Firstly, it was close to Dover, making it convenient for her to look after him. Secondly, Canterbury had richer educational resources. David's aunt had a lawyer acquaintance in Canterbury who assisted her with personal matters such as property management. The lawyer helped David enroll in a suitable school and even kindly allowed him to board at his home. As a result, David became good friends with the lawyer's understanding daughter, Agnes. In summary, David's life in Canterbury was carefree. Apart from a few brief, immature love affairs that stirred the heart of the young David, he had few worries. Finally, at the age of 17, David graduated and officially entered society. However, his aunt wasn't in a hurry to find work for him. She believed David was somewhat naive and suggested that he embark on an extended journey first to gain more experience and worldly wisdom before making long-term plans. During his travels, the inexperienced David indeed suffered many setbacks due to his own naivety, and was often taken advantage of by coachmen and innkeepers. An unexpected encounter occurred during his journey. One day, David ran into Steerforth, his protector from the boarding school. During their conversation, David learned that Steerforth was now a student at the University of Oxford. In the England of that time, it wasn't a problem for middle-class children to attend boarding schools, but attending Oxford or Cambridge was a sign of significant wealth or social status. Dickens, although not explicitly stating it, hinted that Steerforth came from a higher social class than David and the others. David invited Steerforth to accompany him to the next destination on his journey, the home of Peggotty, the maid from his childhood who had taken care of him. In his younger days he had spent some happy times with Peggotty's brother's family. Upon meeting, Steerforth's charm won over the Peggotty family, and he displayed no signs of the snobbery or arrogance typically associated with his social class. Instead, he humbly sought to learn about navigation and fishing from Mr. Peggotty, even purchasing a fishing boat for him to manage locally. Meanwhile, Mr. Peggotty's daughter, Emily, became engaged. It appeared that the Peggotty family was experiencing improved circumstances. However, David soon realized that Steerforth's goodwill was not genuine. Rather, it was an unconscious display of his own sense of superiority. At that time, David couldn't foresee the destinies of Steerforth and the Peggotty family, nor could he fully understand Steerforth's true nature. After concluding his journey, David took his aunt's advice and entered Doctors' Commons to become a proctor. Doctors' Commons served two functions. It was both a training institution for apprentices to become solicitors, approved by the Archbishop, and a professional association of proctors practicing ecclesiastical and civil law, distinct from the ordinary solicitors' associations. Regardless of which path he chose, becoming a proctor or a solicitor guaranteed a secure social position in the future. To facilitate David's entry into Doctors' Commons, his aunt paid a tuition fee of £1,000. What was the significance of £1,000 at that time? In early 19th century Britain, if a family's annual income exceeded £30, it could barely be considered middle income. David's tuition fee was equivalent to the annual income of a typical middle-income family for 20 to 30 years. It could indeed be described as an exorbitant sum. Receiving a job that most people wouldn't even dare to dream of, the young David, fresh to the workforce, was somewhat buoyed by it. Although, in reality, he was still running errands and doing menial tasks, much like what Dickens himself did when he left the shoe polish factory and worked in a law firm. David's social status was incomparable to what Dickens experienced in his earlier years. Consequently, David indulged in some reckless behavior alongside Steerforth and his friends, engaging in many acts typical of a playboy. Up to this point in the story, David is undeniably the central character, with the entire narrative revolving around him. Dickens chose to write centered around individual characters because, at the time, novels were serialized in newspapers before being published as books. Writing in this way made it easier to handle. However, in the latter part of the story, Dickens actively enhanced the overall layout and narrative structure. The novel began to feature two distinct narrative threads, Agnes and Emily. First, let's take a look at Agnes. When David was studying in Canterbury, he had a good rapport with the lawyer's daughter, Agnes. As they grew older, David and Agnes unexpectedly crossed paths again. The young girl he had known had matured into a compassionate, gentle, and sensible young woman. Whenever David felt disheartened or lost, Agnes was there to encourage and guide him to self-improvement. As a result, David held both respect and love for her. Agnes and David had numerous conversations. She advised David not to associate with people like Steerforth and mentioned that her father's law firm needed another partner. David also knew this prospective partner, Uriah Heep, who was around the same age as him. Uriah had initially served as a servant in Agnes's family but, due to years of humility and hard work, was finally on the path to becoming a partner. However, David had always disliked Uriah, believing that his humility was merely a way to curry favor with others, concealing boundless ambition and desire. The story hadn't yet allowed the relationship between Agnes and David to further develop when the narrative suddenly introduced Emily's thread. She had eloped with Steerforth. It turned out that, long before the visit to Peggotty's family, Steerforth had set his sights on Emily. Using the boat purchase as an opportunity, he brought Peggotty's male servant into his confidence and plotted their elopement. Upon losing Emily, Mr. Peggotty was overwhelmed with grief. David accompanied him to Steerforth's house to inquire about the situation, but to their shock, Steerforth's wife's companion claimed that it was Emily who had seduced Steerforth. In 19th century England, it was a serious crime for unmarried women to elope with someone, and when an unmarried woman from a lower social class eloped with an unmarried man from a higher social class, people didn't see it as a Cinderella story. Instead, they blamed the woman for moral corruption and decadence. Therefore, even if Steerforth had seduced Emily, his reputation wouldn't be significantly affected. Instead, it was Emily who found herself completely ostracized from society. misfortunes seemed to come in pairs. Just as Emily had eloped with Steerforth, Aunt Betsy paid a sudden visit and brought news of her bankruptcy. David, who found himself in dire straits, initially attempted to cancel his contract with Doctors' Commons in order to retrieve his £1,000 tuition fee but was met with refusal. Instead, he secured a part-time position as a secretary through Agnes. He also taught himself shorthand and contributed articles on parliamentary news to newspapers. Gradually, David's income stabilized, transforming him from a greenhorn into a capable young man who could hold his own. Dickens, while writing this narrative, drew from his own experiences. Before becoming a writer, Dickens studied shorthand, worked as a parliamentary news reporter, and even used his earnings to help his father pay off debts. Through his own efforts, David eventually managed to restore a semblance of stability to his and Aunt Betsy's life. Simultaneously, his love life progressed as well. He married Dora, the daughter of one of the partners at Doctors' Commons. After their marriage, David and Dora enjoyed a harmonious relationship and an intimate bond. However, Dora was utterly clueless about managing a household and suffered quite a bit from the butler and servants' ire. Unfortunately, barely over a year into their marriage, Dora passed away. David experienced the profound grief of losing his wife, while news from both Emily and Agnes brought better tidings. As it turned out, after eloping with Steerforth, Emily began to travel extensively across the European continent with him. Initially, they were deeply infatuated with each other, but Steerforth gradually grew indifferent to Emily and eventually abandoned her. Just before leaving, Steerforth left Emily to his servant, instructing him to marry her. Steerforth's initial charm hid a vile and cowardly nature underneath. However, during that era, this was a common way for aristocrats to deal with lower-class women. Regardless of how he treated Emily, he would never be the one to face condemnation. This underscores the rigidity of class distinctions and the lowly status of women in British society during that period. Unwilling to be manipulated, Emily escaped while Steerforth's servant wasn't paying attention. Upon receiving news of her disappearance, David and Mr. Peggotty searched far and wide and eventually located Emily in London. On another front, Agnes's fate took a dramatic turn. Her father's law firm had fallen under Uriah Heep's control. Seeing Agnes was about to be coerced into marrying Uriah, Mr. Micawber, who had ended up working for Uriah, stepped forward. He exposed Uriah's embezzlement of public funds and fraudulent acquisition of properties. Only at this point did David discover that Aunt Betsy's bankruptcy was also caused by Uriah. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Uriah confessed to his crimes. It must be said that Dickens was somewhat unfair to the character Uriah Heep. Uriah Heep came from the lower echelons of society and was raised to read people's faces, which led to the distortion of his character and soul, causing him to do anything to rise in society. However, was Uriah Heep inherently more base and corrupt than others? Not necessarily. His transformation into this state was influenced by his environment, which forced him to behave in such a manner. However, Dickens didn't direct his criticism towards the societal structures that led Uriah Heep to his corruption. Instead, he seemed to imply that Uriah Heep's issues stemmed from his unrealistic aspirations to break free from his social class and move up. Uriah Heep's ability to self-educate himself in law, for example, indicated that he had the intelligence and diligence comparable to David. Yet, their fates were entirely different, primarily because Uriah came from the lower rungs of society while David hailed from a respectable middle-class family. So, from Uriah Heep's character, we can clearly see Dickens' conservatism and limitations in terms of class consciousness. With everything settled, Mr. Peggotty planned to take Emily to Australia for a fresh start. As we mentioned before, Emily, who had eloped with someone, had no way to continue living in England. Moving abroad was her only choice. During the Victorian era, Australia seemed to be the preferred destination for desperate or disgraced Britons looking for a fresh start, often preferred over the United States. After dealing with others' affairs, David, now alone, was overwhelmed by the profound grief of losing his wife. He decided to travel to the European continent to soothe his inner sorrow. Encouraged by Agnes, he wrote 2 novels and gradually gained recognition as a novelist. 3 years later, David returned to London once more. He visited Aunt Betsy and expressed his gratitude to Agnes in person. As his relationship with Agnes deepened, David gradually realized that his feelings for her went beyond respect and gratitude. He had fallen deeply in love with her. With courage, David confessed his feelings to Agnes, and she warmly reciprocated. They soon declared their love and were married. Compared to his previous marriage, this union was built not only on emotional attachment, but also on a profound spiritual connection. The story of the novel is now complete. Its enduring appeal, even after more than a century, can be attributed to several factors. Firstly, Dickens possessed remarkable storytelling abilities. As previously mentioned, David Copperfield was serialized before it was published. To capture readers' interest and keep them coming back for more, an author must craft a compelling narrative. While the plot of this novel may not be full of dramatic twists and turns, Dickens introduced dramatic conflicts into David's everyday life. These included moments such as David's journey from London to Dover to seek refuge with Aunt Betsy, and the elopement of Emily and Steerforth. These incidents were written in a heart-pounding and suspenseful manner. Next, Dickens portrayed the various aspects of British society with intricate detail. Perhaps it was because Dickens ventured into society at an early age, witnessed the vicissitudes of life, and experienced the warmth and coldness of human nature. Consequently, he could see what others couldn't see and write what others couldn't. As for character development, it was one of Dickens' strengths. In the novel, whether it's the protagonist David, or the supporting characters like Steerforth and Agnes, or even the minor characters like David's stepfather and stepsiblings, each has a distinct personality and vivid portrayal that leaves a lasting impression. As the ancients often said, an understanding of the world requires knowledge, and skillful interaction with people leads to eloquent writing. This phrase fits Dickens perfectly. Furthermore, Dickens was adept at inserting digressions into the novel, which often became the most fascinating parts of the story. For example, while the core plot of David Copperfield revolves around the ups and downs of David's life, Dickens also included many interesting details, such as how the waiters at an inn went to great lengths to take advantage of David and how Aunt Betsy drove donkeys that dared to enter her yard. Concepts in novels may become outdated, and the moral standards authors defend may change, but these charming details remain timeless. Lastly, the moral values conveyed in the novel resonated strongly with contemporary readers. In David Copperfield, Dickens ruthlessly satirized the snobbishness of the middle class, exposed the moral decay of upper-class individuals like Steerforth, criticized the ruthless climb to the top by any means, as exemplified by Uriah Heep, and praised the simple and good-hearted nature of the Peggotty family, representing the lower class. This moral perspective of reaping what one sows, with good deeds rewarded and evil deeds punished, aligned with the expectations of most readers. David's ability to remain proactive in the face of adversity also resonated with the spirit of the rising British public during the Victorian era. For these reasons, Dickens became the national novelist of his era, and even today, his works remain an important means for us to understand and observe British society during the Victorian era. In this sense, Dickens provides readers with a valuable and vivid cross-section of history. Well, this wraps up our discussion for this time. Let's briefly review the key points. 1. David Copperfield is an autobiographical novel in which Dickens artfully presents his own life experiences in the form of a novel. Reading this novel allows us not only to appreciate Dickens' literary charm but also to gain a rough understanding of his own life. 2. Dickens' views on class are quite complex. On one hand, he no longer considers one's social background as the sole criterion for judging character, which, we must admit, was a progressive and enlightened view for his time. On the other hand, Dickens' critical perspective is limited primarily to the moral sphere. In the novel, we don't see any couples or lovers who can bridge the class gap to come together, nor do we see any characters from humble backgrounds who can break through the rigid class structure to move upward. We also don't find Dickens making any overt criticisms or satires about these social phenomena. This limitation can be attributed to Dickens being constrained by the norms of his era. 3. Dickens' novels were serialized in newspapers, which is why his character-centric writing style was more convenient to work with. However, in the latter part of David Copperfield, Dickens notably strengthened the overall structure and layout, resulting in the emergence of two distinct narrative threads, those of Emily and Agnes. This change also reflects a shift in Dickens' writing style. Well, that concludes the content for this episode. If you enjoyed my video, please click like, subscribe to my channel, and share it with your friends. Thank you.